Have you ever felt as if the universe was conspiring to push you away from the world? As if the more you showed empathy, care, and sensitivity, the more distant you became from people, the more invisible you became. There exists a silence that weighs, a loneliness that hurts, and it seems even more unfair when you know your heart is good. But what if I told you that this loneliness has a deep psychoanalytic explanation? That Freud might explain this distancing not as a punishment, but as an unconscious consequence of how you learn to love and to protect yourself. According to Freud, our unconscious silently shapes the choices we make, the bonds we form, and even the kind of pain we accept without realizing it. And good people, those who feel intensely, who genuinely care, who don't know how to be shallow, often carry deep emotional wounds, traumas buried long ago in childhood. And it is precisely this unconscious baggage that can lead to isolation. Not because the universe wants to punish them, but because these people are, without knowing it, trying to protect themselves from the same kind of pain they've already lived. In childhood, when care failed, whether through abandonment, rejection, constant criticism, or emotional absence, the child built a kind of silent armor. Freud would call this a psychic defense. The child learns not to expect much from others, to trust fantasy more than reality, to rely on themselves emotionally in order to survive. But this defense remains active in adulthood. And here lies the paradox. These people become excellent at caring for others, but terrible at letting others care for them. They give, but they withdraw when someone gets too close. And this cycle, however subtle, pushes them toward loneliness. The universe, in this sense, does not isolate good people out of malice. It responds to the unconscious frequency these people emit. Freud would say the unconscious is like a magnet. It attracts experiences that confirm the emotional patterns we already know. And if your pattern is abandonment, you might, without meaning to, push people away or choose those who are unavailable. This doesn't happen rationally. It happens because deep down, this is what your unconscious recognizes as familiar, as safe. Because paradoxically, the known hurts, but it gives a false sense of control. And here begins the isolation. Good people end up living in a rich but painful inner world. They feel too much but share too little. They see others with depth but feel no one sees them the same way. They accumulate silences, disappointments, and frustrated hopes. And the more intensely they feel, the harder it is to find someone who truly understands them. But Freud also believed in the possibility of breaking this cycle. Self-knowledge, he said, is the key that unlocks the doors of the unconscious. And when we begin to recognize the patterns we repeat, we can change the script of our story. Isolation, then, stops being a destiny and becomes a temporary reflection, a necessary interval for healing, not an eternal punishment. This is why many good people go through long phases of loneliness. They are unconsciously revisiting old pains, trying to understand why the bonds they create don't hold, why the relationships they desire don't materialize. They are in silence trying to heal something that was never spoken. And the universe in this process is not punishing. It is making space. It is allowing them to listen to themselves, to find themselves again, to prepare for relationships where they no longer need to erase themselves. Maybe you are living this exact moment now. Maybe you feel like no one understands you, that you give too much and receive too little, that there is a quiet sadness no one notices, but that you carry like an invisible weight. Freud would call this neurotic suffering, a pain with no name, but that manifests in emotional symptoms, in repeated failures, in inexplicable withdrawals. And the first step to breaking this cycle is to recognize your pain has a history, and every history, once understood, can be rewritten. Have you ever wondered why, even when doing your best, the world seems to respond with distance? Why, the more empathy you offer, the more you feel excluded, forgotten, ignored? According to Freud, this is no coincidence. It is repetition. In psychoanalysis, there is a fundamental concept, the compulsion to repeat. Freud observed that people, even unconsciously, tend to repeat the same emotional patterns, especially those rooted in childhood traumas. And when we speak of good people, those who give with an open heart, we are often speaking of individuals who, at some point in life, were emotionally neglected. It's not that they didn't receive affection, but perhaps they received conditional love. Love that only came when they behaved a certain way, when they pleased, when they were good. Outcome. This kind of affection teaches a dangerous lesson, that to deserve love, you must earn it. You must do something, be something. It is never unconditional. And so a pattern is born. Give, 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 without ever feeling worthy of receiving. Over time, these people become experts at erasing themselves to fit into other spaces. They are the ones who listen to everyone but are rarely heard, who always help but are rarely helped. And the world, noticing this near limitless giving, settles in. It begins to demand more than it gives, and this slowly pushes them even further away. But the most unsettling thing is what Freud reveals about unconscious desire. Sometimes we seek the same kind of pain we already know. Unconsciously, we choose relationships that confirm what we've already felt. Rejection, abandonment, indifference. Because even if painful, these experiences are familiar, and the unconscious prefers the known to the unknown, even if the known is suffering. This is how the universe seems to isolate these people, not as punishment, but because they, without realizing it, build invisible walls to protect themselves from rejection. They learn to avoid deep bonds, to distrust gestures of affection, to retreat when someone gets too close. And all of this happens in silence. The soul armors itself. The rational mind doesn't notice, but the heart feels. It feels absence. It feels pain. It feels emptiness. Freud also spoke of the pleasure principle, the constant search to avoid pain and find relief. But when pleasure mixes with trauma, the result is confusion. You may feel pleasure in helping someone, even if it leaves you emotionally exhausted. You may feel pleasure in maintaining a relationship where you aren't valued, because it confirms, deep down, the belief that you are not enough. And all of this feeds emotional isolation. And here comes another crucial point: the role of silence. Good people often don't scream for help. They withdraw. They believe being strong means enduring everything quietly. They fear being a burden, seeming needy, being judged. So instead of asking for company, they accept loneliness. Instead of showing their pain, they smile. Instead of demanding reciprocity, they keep giving until they burn out. This emotional exhaustion is subtle but corrosive. It chips away at self-esteem, joy, enthusiasm. And the world outside keeps turning, not noticing that behind those kind eyes is a tired heart. And at this point, many good people start to believe something is wrong with them, that maybe they aren't meant to love, that they're hard to handle, that they're doomed to loneliness. But the truth is different. Freud would say this feeling of inadequacy isn't yours. It was implanted. It came from past experiences, inherited patterns, stories that repeated throughout your life without your awareness. And now, what's happening isn't isolation. It's a call to heal. The universe isn't pushing you away from people. It's bringing you closer to yourself. Because for Freud, real transformation only happens when the unconscious becomes conscious. And when you start noticing your patterns, when you recognize the choices you always repeat, when you understand your pain has roots much deeper than they appear, you begin to free yourself. You begin to break the cycles. You begin to make space for the new, for reciprocal love, for true intimacy, for relationships that don't demand your pain as currency. And it's precisely at this point that loneliness, which once seemed like punishment, reveals itself as a portal, a necessary interval between old pain and the possibility of a new emotional destiny. The universe didn't isolate you. It protected you while you rebuilt yourself. And this rebuilding begins with self-knowledge. You might think loneliness came from outside, but often it comes from within. It's the reflection of a mind that, exhausted from hurting, decides to protect itself. A mind that prefers isolation to risking another rejection, that prefers silence to the weight of another disappointment, that pulls back not because it doesn't want to be loved, but because it's afraid it won't be enough to be loved for real. Good people feel this fear more intensely because all their lives they were taught to believe that being good meant being useful, that their worth lay in what they could do for others, not in the simple fact of existing. And when this usefulness disappears, they feel they no longer have a place. This is where the universe steps in. This isolation you're experiencing may feel like a punishment, but in truth, it's a pause, a strategic pause from life. Freud would say it's the moment when the ego needs to reorganize, when for the first time, you stop defining yourself through others and start looking at yourself. With pain, yes, but also with truth, with honesty, with courage. Because it's only in this empty space without noise, without distraction, that you can hear what you've always tried to avoid. The truth about how much you abandoned yourself trying to be accepted. The truth about how much you stayed silent to maintain relationships that hurt you. The truth about how much you tried to be perfect to avoid abandonment and were still left behind. And when this truth comes, it hurts, it burns, but it also liberates. It liberates because you begin to understand that being good doesn't mean erasing yourself, that having empathy doesn't require suffering in silence, that love isn't the same as sacrifice, that healthy relationships don't demand constant effort just to be seen, heard, or valued. You begin to realize it's okay to choose yourself, that walking away from environments that drain you isn't selfishness, it's self-care. At this point, isolation no longer feels like punishment. It reveals itself as the womb of a new self, the sacred place where you rebuild, where finally you begin to write a new story based on conscious choices, not unconscious traumas. And maybe this is exactly why the universe pulled you away from everything, so you could find yourself. Because as Freud said, we are made of flesh, but we must live as if we were spirit. And to live as spirit means to seek meaning, connection, authenticity. It means stopping the repetition of patterns just because they're familiar. It means facing pain as a portal to growth. And if you've made it this far, if you're reading this, hearing these words, feeling this impact, it's because something inside you has already begun to awaken. Change doesn't happen in a snap, but it starts with a simple moment of awareness. The universe isolates good people for a reason, so they realize they are too good to beg for recognition in places that don't see them. So they stop trying to fit into spaces too small for their giant hearts. So they cease being who the world expected and finally become who they were born to be. And now the next step is yours. The decision to leave the cycle of pain and enter the cycle of healing. The decision to no longer accept emotional crumbs. The decision to love yourself with the same intensity you've always loved others. Because in the end, the greatest reunion you'll have in this life is with yourself.